Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Jus Commune podcast. My name is Emilia Mataix Ferrandiz from the International University of Catalonia in Barcelona. And here I have the pleasure today to interview Professor Clifford Ando from the University of Chicago, who is the Robert Anderson Distinguished Service Professor of Classics History in the college. He has been chair of the Department of Classics for 2 terms. And he has different recognitions, like, for example, he's selected member of the American Academy of Sciences and Letters. He has been also visiting professor of different institutions as well. And he has published a number of edited volumes and his own volumes. For example, the latest one will be with Miles Laban, Roman Law and Local Citizen in the Long Second Century. And his research focuses on the histories of religion, law, and government in the ancient world. His first book centered on the history of political culture in the provinces of the Roman Empire, and now he continues to write and advise on topics related to provincial administration, the relationship between imperial power and local cultural change, and the form and structure of ancient empires. But today, we are here to talk more concretely about a recent project of him, where he's the general editor. It's called Roman Statutes Renewing Roman Law, a collaborative project that will produce a new edition, translation, and commentary on all epigraphically preserved Roman laws. Welcome, Cliff. Thank you very much for being here.
Hello, and thank you very much for the invitation.
So, your project, Roman Statutes, aims to produce the first comprehensive, accurate, and freely available repository of all surviving inscribed legislation from classical Rome. And I would like to start with a simple question. Can you introduce us to the time frame addressed by your project and explain how the different political contexts of the Roman world affect the study of the sources?
Right. So it might be first be useful to say something about the core concerns and the context of discovery of the documents, and for that matter, context of generation. So when most people think about Roman law, and in particular, when people think about the influence of Roman law on Europe, and when modern lawyers in the civil law countries are trained in Roman law in law schools, they're principally educated in what the Romans would call private law, in the law that governs economic and social relations among individual subjects of government or individual subjects of law. And the material at the heart of what they study is, in essence, the jurisprudence, above all, that was transmitted in a textual tradition, copied and recopied. That is, we know it through the copying and recopying and editing of text. In the case of law, the text, as it were, that is primarily or overwhelmingly responsible for the modern European knowledge of the Roman legal past is, as many people know, a collection of excerpts made in the 6th century under the direction of the Emperor Justinian, in which earlier documents by jurists were in essence sliced apart with a pair of scissors, and excerpts were taped together in order to collect the opinions of the jurists under rubrics or under specific topics. But the Romans produced many kinds of legal documents, including laws passed by the assembly of the Roman people, as well as things that they also called laws that were issued by magistrates. And in particular, with which this project is concerned, as I will talk about shortly, the specific magistrates produced laws that the Romans called leges, not voted on by the people, but nevertheless concerned with the regulation of public properties. So with the collection of taxes or the affairs of public markets, or for that matter, everything like road maintenance, the sharing of water from public infrastructure, irrigation water in particular. These latter documents, the things that the Romans called laws regulating public concerns, are transmitted to us today, are known to us today, primarily through copies that were made in antiquity. The Romans used, where possible, a special medium for the publication of laws, namely sheets of bronze, at least for laws when they were produced in Latin. And these survive from a remarkable range of contexts, from, in essence, the toe of Italy straight through to the foothills of the Alps, and from the southern tip of Iberia straight up through Central Europe in a municipal context along the Danube. Chronologically, the documents range from approximately the year 122 BCE to the end of the reign of Marcus Aurelius, to circa 177 CE. So almost exactly 300 years. Perhaps the last thing to be mentioned, merely by way of introduction, is that although we call these things Roman laws, as my description of the context of discovery should make clear, the laws, although generated at Rome, deal not simply with, as it were, social and economic conduct and the exercise of public power in the city of Rome, that is to say, by Roman magistrates magistrates ruling over Roman citizens. Instead, they are concerned virtually every conceivable exercise of public power in what had by then become a large and multicultural empire. So the laws tell us things about how the Romans understood the Roman relation to other forms of private property in imperial landscapes. They tell us things about how the Romans wished local communities to reorganize themselves so that their politics was, as it were, recognizable or legible to Rome, and so on and so forth. It's an extraordinary corpus that addresses myriad questions about the rise and functioning of the Roman Empire.
Thank you very much. In the past, other projects have attempted to compile and study Roman statutes, not as ambitiously as you're saying, and maybe with a more niche or narrow, idea of what a law, actually a lex is. So I'm thinking, evidently, about Crawford's Roman statutes, or this Rotondis Leges Publicae Populi Romani, or even this Fira de Fontis Iuris Romani ante Justiniani. So when you started thinking about your project, did you were based on this sort of like previous attempts, or you had an original idea that you don't think it spans from there?
The project of myself and my collaborators builds on an extraordinary tradition of scholarship, and it's important at every step of the way to acknowledge the amazing contributions made by earlier scholars to the knowledge of Roman law and to these texts as well. So let me say a quick word about that history, and then perhaps just something about what we're seeking to do and why we thought it was important to do again. So perhaps the most important the story not of the discovery of these documents, but the story of the production of books like ours, of collections of these documents, begins meaningfully in the 16th century. So one of the first, for example, one of the first moments of discovery of a document like this, in which the discovery was heralded in public life, was the discovery of a tablet of a document now called the Lex de Imperio Vespasiani, the law on the power of command of the Emperor Vespasian. I have myself a strong suspicion that the title is incorrect, that it was not a law about his imperium at all, but that's a separate problem. The tablet was brought forward by Cola di Rienzo, a man who styled himself the tribune of the Roman people in the second quarter of the 14th century. And from then on, with a kind of irregular periodicity, people have discovered, often archaeologically, new documents of this kind. Sometimes large numbers of bronze tablets, rarely, but sometimes, and sometimes small pieces, sometimes whole single tablets, and so forth. And the first scholarly, you might say, scientific collection of such documents was made in the 16th century by Antonio Augustin. And since then, there have been very, very regular projects by historians of law and by Roman historians, maybe every 25 years for 400 years, to produce new editions of the surviving statutes. And perhaps the main reason for each new collection over time has been the discovery of new material. And that is a factor in what we're doing as well, that even since the last scientific edition in 1996, new material has come to light that we would like to include. But you raised a second point that I should mention, which is the Romans used the term law to refer to different kinds of documents. Sometimes the Romans could refer to things that we would call treaties as laws, in part because they were voted on by the people. The Romans could refer to statutes, that is to say, general rules that regulated classes of social action or classes of economic conduct or classes of crime. The Romans could produce laws, things that we would call statutes. Magistrates could issue regulations for, say, contracts involving public money or regulations involving spheres of public activity that were issued under the authority of the magistrate and not voted on by the people, and those they also called laws. And some recent projects like ours have been differentiated according to, let us say, the formal rules they adopt for inclusion or exclusion. So an important difference between the last such collection in 1996, a project led by Michael Crawford in London, but including contributions from scholars all over Europe, like our present project. The 1996 project adopted a formal rule that they would include only things they called statutes, which is to say laws passed by the Roman people covering general classes of public action. One result was, just to choose perhaps the two most egregious cases, is that closely related historical documents which shed mutual light on each other are not available between the same two covers, or given that one of our ambitions is to produce a publicly accessible database, they're not available on the same website. So let me offer two quick examples and we can continue. One is, in the year 101 BC, the Romans wrote a law offering principally instructions to the next year's magistrates on how to go about the incorporation of some new territories in the Aegean world. That is, Roman magistrates had been establishing provinces in peninsular Greece and elsewhere in the Aegean for some time. And the Roman people voted on a law in 101 offering instructions to the magistrates of 100 on how to further the project of what we might call the provincialization of the Aegean world. Around the same time, loosely speaking, one of the territories that the Romans had incorporated was the province of Asia, that is to say, the very rich territory at the southwest corner of modern-day Turkey, or of Asia Minor. And although we know that the Romans established a variety of rules regulating the collection of taxes from the newly formed province of Asia at the moment of acquisition, about some decades ago, we discovered a text of a censorial law, of a law issued by a magistrate and not voted on by the people, issued under the authority of the magistrate, regulating the collection of customs duties for goods entering and leaving the province of Asia. This document about the collection of taxes obviously tells us a great deal about the world in which the law of the year 101 intervened. But because the law of 101 was issued upon a vote of the people, and the tax law of Asia was just issued under the authority of a magistrate, the team in 1996 excluded the tax law. So as it were, you can read the law of 101 in their book, but in order to inform yourself about this other nearly contemporaneous and valuable document, you have to run to another book. And similarly, the collection from 1996 includes a colonial charter from the age of Julius Caesar, although the copy we have is not from the time of Julius Caesar, but a colonial charter from the era of Julius Caesar. But it does not include any of the various municipal charters we have from the 1st century CE and going forward. But obviously, how the Romans organized municipalities is mutually informative in relation to how the Romans organized public life in colonies. But again, that is a case where closely related documents, because of a formal distinction, some are found in the 1996 project and some were excluded from the 1996 project. The group got together and spoke about this for some time, and I have to confess that beyond discussing some formal rules as regulated the project in 1996, we also just adopted a principle of utility, that we wanted the results of our project to be more useful to more people addressing more historical questions than before. And for that purpose, we decided to be more inclusive.
So if I understand correctly, then your database will link different laws, like from past to, more forward and all that. So it will be linking different statutes, or how you want to call them, laws from different periods that have maybe had an impact on each other, or at least you can see some traces of it. So actually what you're doing then is kind of like an archaeology, actually, of like lawmaking. This is really, really interesting, actually. Yeah, what I'm wondering is, like, you are, as you say, you're trying to be inclusive. And I was just asking you about the interconnection from your database. So basically, you're doing this kind of archaeology of one source takes the other. There's one idea that fascinates me from the Roman world, that is, I've always seen like an absence of hierarchy among different sources. But have you seen any reference from one law to other law? And then if there's any kind of hierarchy of the sources in your research of different statutes or leges?
So let me attempt to speak to to separate and address those questions in order. The first having to do with the extent to which the laws, or you might say more broadly, the different sources of legal information make reference to each other, with some historical implications that I think I'm still trying to tease out. So it's a very good question. And the second having to do with hierarchy. The quick answer to the first question is that the laws do make frequent reference to each other.
Okay.
Often enough in the form of what a modern American lawyer would call a savings clause, which is to say that, the Romans will issue a sequence of laws that touch on the same topic. They were aware that they were the writers of a statute in the year 111 were fully aware that what they were saying interrelated or closely connected or potentially affected the use of an earlier law. And they would say somewhere in a clause of the later law, nothing in clause 5 of this text is to be taken as interfering with the actualization of clause 4 from the statute passed in, the statute, the lex ferrandes passed in the year when so and so and so and so were consuls. So they were aware of something like a history of legislative action, and they tried to take care to specify when a later statute did or did not interfere with the application of an earlier statute. So that is a very regular feature of the text that we have. Now, I'll mention one interesting fact that arises from a collation of all such references. You mentioned earlier Rotondi's Leges Publicae Populi Romani. If you look at, now Rotondi was not intending to produce a collection of the actual documents. Rotondi was producing a reference work which told you what laws the Roman people had passed. It listed it gave ancient testimonia, references to the ancient texts that tell us something about this, and some summary of what we think the law actually said, and a few mentions of bibliography on that text. And in addition to projects like ours, which produces editions of these documents, there have been several different projects like Rotondi's, which are in essence reference work about the laws, not editions of the documents themselves. If you look at projects like Rotondi's, these people believe that the Romans wrote literally hundreds of statutes, hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of these things. There's the Lex Ando, the Lex Crawford, the Lex Ferrandes, and on and on and on. And sometimes they will insist that prominent families produce multiple laws. There's the Lex Crawford and there's the Lex Michael Crawford and there's the Lex Robert Crawford and the Lex on and on and on and on. For many of these things, and sometimes when I've spoken about this project and about the kind of historical questions it's raising, I've used a picture from Rotondi in which a law from the 3rd century BCE, the first ancient testimony to its existence, is in Macrobius's Saturnalia, which is to say a kind of a philosophical dialogue written in the year 430 CE. So if we're to believe scholars working in this tradition of Roman law, the Romans produced hundreds of statutes, some of which we know nothing about until somebody bothered to write down the name of the law, let us say somewhere between 650 and 700 years after its passage. But we're to believe that the law existed in spite of the fact that the Romans happily went 650 years without ever mentioning it. And against this, I merely suggest the data available in the laws themselves, in which the people who are actually writing Roman laws make reference to earlier legislative activity, that the earliest law cited in an extant Roman statute is from the year 149 BCE. So the people who wrote Roman laws were at some level conscientious historians, because they knew they were intervening in a historical context, and their knowledge of Roman law, or at least their citations of Roman law, do not extend before the year 149. So that's one answer to your question is, do they make reference to earlier statutes? The answer is yes. And the pattern of their references is actually interesting. The pattern of their references to earlier laws does not look like what we think of as our knowledge of Roman legal history. Mm-hmm. You ask a second question, which is about how do these laws sit in relation to each other and in relation to other forms of norm making? That is, do they emerge with a hierarchy? If, for instance, the project of 1996, when it said it was going to collect only statutes voted on by the people, was that because in some level, even the Romans themselves thought, for example, that statutes voted on by the Roman people were actually just somehow more important or overruled other forms of norm making. You might, to use kind of legal theoretical language, the Romans recognized the existence of multiple sources of law, magistrates, people. You could even say the people voting in assembly as opposed to narrowly the plebs voting in assembly or the emperor and so forth. There are many different ways one could make law. And how do they sit in relation to each other? And the principal rule that the Romans use is simply that whatever norm is produced later overrules or potentially overrules or surpasses or surmounts or abrogates earlier legislation. As a kind of constitutional principle, late Republican politicians, not necessarily legislators themselves, but late Republican politicians and historical sources offer a kind of phrase, quod populus nuper iusit. Whatever the people has recently commanded, that is law. And in historical sources, every now and then, I don't know, in a historical narrative in Livy, even regarding a kind of an issue of, as it were, procedure. The question arises in Livy, should somebody holding a particular priesthood be seated as a member of the Roman Senate? One person gets up and says, oh no, our ancestors didn't used to do that. And another person gets up and says, yes, but recently we have. And whatever we do more recently, that is law. And there came a time, actually a rather narrow time in Roman culture, much more narrow than we think, in which the Romans talked a lot about the importance of tradition. And when they talked about tradition, they often pointed to some hoary past. They used the term maiores, which Anglophone Latinists will often translate ancestors. But of course, it doesn't mean ancestors. It means betters, or the better people, or something like that, the greater people. References to the maiores, I'll continue to use the term ancestors. References to the ancestors as a source of authority arise in Latin in a very specific moment in time, at the very end of the 2nd century. And to a large extent, in lawmaking or in political argument, it disappears after a while too. The importance of ancestors and of the hoary past to Romans as a source of norms is actually fairly narrow. And in legal argument and in lawmaking, it's perfectly clear that they accepted something like a constitutional principle that the people or the people's representatives were always and absolutely entitled to overrule earlier versions of themselves. For example, just to speak about constitutional rules, the Romans did not recognize the possibility of establishing something like a principle of a supermajority. Mm-hmm. That one version of the people in the year 2024 could bind future versions of the people by requiring a different procedure for laws on taxation, like to change rules on taxation in the state of California in the United States. Now you need a kind of particular supermajority because an earlier version of the people of California decided to bind later versions of themselves. That the Romans did not recognize as a possibility.
Well, there are several questions that are arising from what you're saying. I hope that. Well, I'm going to phrase them separately because if not, it will be too much information. And regarding to what you said, and this is just a curiosity, you mentioned the maiores appears in a very peculiar moment of time. Does that say anything about the political context? Because, well, talking about public law and politics obviously goes by hand. So do you have any suspect, any theory about this?
Yeah, the context in which you start to see references to the ancestors, and once you start to see it, it becomes a kind of prominent feature of a political argument, is a context of extraordinarily rapid change, both in the scale of the empire and as a consequence of the expansion of empire in something like the political economy of public life of Rome itself. The Romans tell a story that they tell many different kinds of stories about the consequences for Rome of Rome's having become an empire. That, let's just say at a simple numerical level, the more different provinces you rule, the more different places you have to send annual magistrates to function as supervisors, or as you might say, governors. If you're going to send more people out into the world to function as governors, and those people must once have held public power at Rome before they can be appointed, ultimately, the Romans had to change the structure of magistracies at Rome, in part, of course, because of changing problems of scale inside the city, but in effect, they had to change the distribution of public power within the city of Rome in order to generate human bodies to send outside the city of Rome. For example, as just one simple problem. So they felt that the extraordinary wealth that Roman magistrates began to bring back into the city was changing many things about civic life. It changed the location of certain kinds of agricultural production because there were enough rich people living around the city of Rome that it became profitable, in essence, to grow luxury vegetables around the city of Rome, which displaced other forms of agricultural production further away. Another example. And that certain kinds of politicians and families having access to enormous wealth changed the nature of competition for office. Having just endured an election in the United States in which, the two different political parties each spent well in excess of $1 billion trying to win the presidency. I have direct experience of the changing political economy of elections. So I will simply say that it's clear that the Romans felt at the end of the 2nd century, commencing at least by, let's say, the 130s, and in a kind of ongoing way, perhaps even in a kind of an accelerating way, that the material conditions and the social conditions of politics were changing radically in a fashion that, as it were, norm-making, simple passing of laws, and something like rules of order in the Roman Senate couldn't keep up. And the emergence of a loosey-goosey principle of politics called respect for one's ancestors was a way to try and impose a moral constraint on political and legal action, because, as it were, political action was not capable of somehow catching up, or so it was felt. And I have a feeling that I don't think that's a controversial thing to say, but I suspect that that's the context in which references to the ancestors have become terribly prominent.
Yeah. No.
Just to finish up, one funny thing about the concept of the ancestors is there was no content to the Mos Maiorum. So in perhaps the funniest invocation, or the most ironic invocation of the concept of Mos Maiorum, there was a proposal in the very late Roman Republic to establish a command in the Eastern Aegean to deal with a particular military situation, and to put the commander Gnaeus Pompeius, Pompey, into this command. And it was irregular in a variety of ways, principally having to do with scale, but it hardly matters. But it was described by opponents of the legislation as an innovation. And therefore, they said, it is against the customs of our ancestors.
It is very clever to have that.
The speech in favor, the one speech we have that still exists in favor of this, which is by Cicero, says, no, my opponents are mistaken about what the customs of our ancestors were. The most important customs of our ancestors was to innovate in response to changing circumstances. So both parties, for and against, cited the customs of the ancestors, and they simply attributed different content or different normative meaning to the customs of the ancestors. So it was it's a conservative sounding concept.
Yeah.
But it was certainly possible to invoke it for non-conservative ends.
Yeah. No, it's very interesting. It's actually very helpful for them, that the fact that they don't define many things, so then you can use a concept for everything. So in that sense, one thing that has come to my head, and actually something I think I have been thinking for a long time, how does this, act of like quoting past laws, or the ancestor said that maybe in this case Cicero was making it up. One colleague of mine says we should not trust Cicero in many things, but anyway. So how does this cope with transmission of knowledge and archiving and libraries? We don't really know that much about that. So how do they actually, because you go in charge, you are now a magistrate, they don't give you a booklet of like, these are the kind of things you should know. How do you know about that?
That's a fantastic question, about which, as it were, an enormous amount of information has been available that's very hard to systematize. And one of the reasons it's hard to systematize is because it looks an awful lot like the Romans themselves give the impression that even people in positions of power had something like non-systematic knowledge, or not automatic access to knowledge. So let me offer two illustrations each at two extremes, if I can keep all of this in my head. Although, as you say, a colleague of yours has said to distrust Cicero.
Well, but that's her opinion. You can trust Cicero, it's fine. Many people trust Cicero, actually. So,
at one point in his life, Cicero offered a kind of account of, he announced, he posed the question, what is the duty of a senator? And, or some phrase like this. And he said, the duty of the senator is to know the state, to nosse rem publicam. And then he offers an itemization of something like the forms of knowledge or the things that a senator needed to know to responsibly sit in this Council of State. And it is a remarkable list of revenues, treaties, past legislation, and so on. It assumes that some spheres of government activity, like the collection of revenues, they are rationalized in a kind of Weberian sense, and that something like accounts are produced of them. That is to say, beyond knowing where the gold was heaped up, which would be one kind of thing to know, that it was actually possible to know how much money was coming in from where, and something about the government's liquidity so that you knew what was available to be spent at any given time, for example. And his reference to knowing the laws makes you think that there must be. I mean, it'd be trivial to say, or stupid to say, you must know the laws if it was impossible to go somewhere and read them, and so on. And I could say more about this. This phrase was the subject of an extraordinary, just magnificent article of the great French historian Claude Nicollet. So I think the only publication of Nicollet I know where, so far as I can tell, the English version is longer and more detailed than the French version. The English version was last published exclusively as a pamphlet after he gave it as a lecture. But it's an amazing document. And it points to exactly the issue you're talking about, that Cicero thought that he and his peers in the Senate could know the state. To move in a completely different direction, in the reign of Marcus Aurelius, grant of citizenship was made to the leader of something like a non-urbanized tribe in North Africa. And for this purpose, someone commanded that an authenticated copy be made of the grant of citizenship from some archive.
Yeah.
And paraphrasing from memory, it says, this document was copied and checked from the archive of grants of citizenship of the emperors Augustus, Tiberius, blah, 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 including both divinized magistrates and non-divinized magistrates, including emperors of the year 69 straight up to the present day. And what it clearly claim is that something like a record of all grants of citizenship of all emperors in chronological order sat somewhere in Rome. Mm-hmm. So these two documents, and I could cite many others, they claim different kinds of documents, one an archival record itself, one a speech of Cicero, or a philosophical work of Cicero, supposes that perfect governmental knowledge exists somewhere in Rome, perhaps. By contrast, right, of course, again, famously, in the correspondence of this Pliny, the governor of Bithynia Pontus in the reign of Trajan, and the correspondence that he exchanged with the Emperor Trajan, not only Pliny as governor out in the wilds of Asia Minor, but the emperor himself confess, each of them to each other, that they don't necessarily have copies of the documents to which each other is referring. Pliny appears to know at least one text because a provincial litigator brought it before him. And at one point, Trajan asked Pliny, hey, could you send me a copy of that? Well, if the emperor doesn't have access, who does? Even the most powerful and central actors in the Roman world appear to exist in a state of imperfect knowledge, despite some pretty clear references to institutions that are supposed to collect that knowledge. We have an inscription from Sardinia of the adjudication of a territorial dispute between two tribes. I'm not going to mention the names because I'll probably remember them incorrectly. The magistrate's name is Helvius Agrippa.
That is a lot. You already remember
right?
that.
And one of the parties to the dispute makes reference to a map which exists in Rome, presumably either a map generated in an earlier version of the dispute, or quite possibly, my memory may be imperfect, or possibly a map of the province generated at the moment of the provincialization of Sardinia. But the governor grants a stay in the proceedings, in the hearing. He says, we're going to take a pause in the hearing for some, maybe 2 months, if my memory is correct. So somebody can go to the city of Rome and check the map. Mm-hmm. So again, people all around the Roman world believe that oftentimes somewhere else, accurate governmental knowledge relating to these spaces or issues where the interests of the state intersect with local concerns, boundaries, that knowledge of that is preserved somewhere, often enough in the city of Rome.
Yeah.
It's not easy to get at it. It may exist in an only theoretical way, but they imagine their lives being regulated by governmental knowledge.
So you're making me look at the Roman Empire in a kind of like more, how to say that, conspiracy theory, more than before. No, because actually, one of my questions that was arising from there, you mentioned, I think you were mentioning the Lex Banacitana before, the one of the granting of the citizenship. Tabula Banacitana, yeah. So you mentioned a copy. And in this case, okay, it's the grant of citizenship to a tribe, so it's kind of like a nice thing in a way, So I'm wondering, when you see copies of your documents, and I'm sure that when you're studying those different status, you see different copies. Can you see in these copies, kind of like a political intent or something? Because one is this citizen, and the other, for example, is the Senatus Consultus of Neopisone Patri. That was kind of like more an exercise of political propaganda there. But in this case, for example, with the citizenship, what are copies for? What are the different intentions behind copies? Do you see that there's kind of like a way, that they decide to do copies of something besides the emperor saying, "I am the emperor now," or something like that?
So I'll mention quickly three things, as it were: the use of a copy by the audience of the text itself. Second, the retention of a copy by a third party to the exchange. And then three, the problem of doctored or altered or fake copies. Because all of them testify to something like the value of the document. So one, many parties kept copies of documents related to their own affairs where they thought it would be useful to them. So this applies both to laws, where obviously at some level, some of these municipal and colonial charters were, as it were, neutral documents that regulated public affairs, but it's useful for you to have a copy. And in a number of the cases where we have copies of these laws, the most famous in the context of my own project or our project, because it's a group project, in the context of the group project on Roman statutes, the most significant case is precisely the colonial charter of the Caesarian colony at Colonia Genitiva Julia, or in vernacular terms, the colony at Orso, because the copy is, loosely speaking, 100 years after the foundation of the colony, where it seems clear that for some reason, presumably the earlier text was being eroded, it had been publicly posted for 100 years, it was becoming illegible, whatever the case may be, they reinscribed the whole thing. So that would be a case where not only do we know that they retained it, but they took some care that it should continue to be legible and therefore useful, perhaps even in a symbolic form. I mean, who knows how many times people referred to it, but having a legible, bright, shiny copy was felt to be important. And we know of other cases, like rules issued by the emperor that make reference to senatorial decrees and so forth about the obligation of parties in provincial landscapes to provide food and accommodation to passing soldiers, in which it's clear that individual parties retained copies of it so that when some soldier or commander came banging on their door and said, we want to put up 100 soldiers on your property and you have to feed them for the next 5 days, the person could point to the copy and say, no. So it had an instrumental or utility. It had an instrumental value or utility to the addressee, and they kept a copy because it helped them. Mm-hmm. That's one. Two, we're moving a bit apart from something like legislation proper, but we do know of cases in which, for example, a Roman emperor refused to grant a particular privilege to a city. If my memory is correct, it's Smyrna, on the grounds that the privilege was a very great honor, and therefore the emperor wished to restrict the honor to the most important cities who were the closest friends of the Roman people, in this case, the city of Aphrodisias. And the document that refuses the privilege to Smyrna, needless to say, we have never found a copy at Smyrna of the letter rejecting their request. Right? I don't know, if you're an American university student and you get into a fancy schmancy university, but you get declined by another one, you tend to keep the letter that says, yoo-hoo, Cliff, you got into the University of Chicago. You don't keep the letter that says you were rejected from Harvard. Mm-hmm. Well, in this case, Smyrna does not, we have no copy from Smyrna of the letter rejecting their privilege. We do have a copy from Aphrodisias of the letter rejecting Smyrnus because the letter mentioned Aphrodisias with praise. So that's a case where a third party, there was a bilateral exchange between the emperor and Smyrna, but a third party kept the copy. And I could cite other examples of that.
Yeah.
And then as a final matter, right, I'm not going to remember again all the details exactly, but in the late 4th and early 5th century, representatives of the Bishop of Rome went running around the western part of the then Roman Empire, which was on the verge of collapse. But representatives of the Bishop of Rome went running around the Western Empire with fake copies of the canons of the Council of Nicaea, in which they had added a completely fictitious final canon, which said that the Bishop of Rome is to be supreme in the church. And one of the friends of Augustine, Alypius Quodwald, and I don't think it's Quodwald Deus, it may have been Alypius, one of the friends of Augustine is on record challenging the representative of the Bishop of Rome, saying, it's very interesting that your copy of the canons of the Nicaea has this extra canon. Because I've gone around, he's like a modern day philologist. He said, I've gone running around the churches of North Africa, consulting our individual copies of the canons of Nicaea, and that canon, that final clause is not in there. So these documents produced by institutions were felt to be important and powerful enough that it was worth producing fake ones.
Yeah. And luckily there was people who had time enough to go around North Africa and checking that his interest was big, I imagine. Yeah, I'm assuming. I want to start with these big questions that you have in the website of your project. Can a new translation of classical Roman laws usher in a revolution in the fields of Roman history and the history of law? The project is ending now, at the end of this year, if I'm not wrong.
Well, the first grants that we got are ending. I think we always felt that it was likely to be a 5 and possibly a 6-year project. So the first phase of our funding is ending.
Okay.
And I think we're close to on schedule, but it's going to take a little bit more time. We will plead with the world for some indulgence for
indulgence from the Caesar of the money. So what is the revolution looking actually now? Like are you ushering a revolution in with these translations?
So I hope it will produce significant change in a variety of areas. You mentioned earlier distrust of Cicero. So let me just pick up on that. I don't mean to.
Yeah, I see that you have really.
Right. No, but it's a kind of serious matter, right? Let me mention one area, very old, right? But it's in a kind of way ongoing important. When the Roman Empire expanded, they seized some territory, or some land, I should say, in particular, valuable agricultural land, and made it the property of the Roman people as a formal matter. And at different times in Roman history, the Romans had slightly different regulations about who could use so-called public land. Sometimes they said you had to rent it from the Roman people, and you could rent it in units of the following size, and so on and so forth. And, the record keeping about this wasn't very good, to return to the problem of record keeping. So every now and then somebody would be using much more public land than they were supposed to. And there were kind of back efforts to control it. And sometimes they said, we're going to privatize the land. It's just the whole record keeping thing was obviously such a mess that they said, okay, whatever, we're going to grant private persons title to what had formerly been public land, but there will be constraints on how much someone could have. And I mention all of this because wealthy interests at Rome got very upset at virtually any of these attempts to exploit a public resource. The same sort of fights go on in the United States now, in which, there are federal lands, i.e. literally lands owned by the American people, on which people can graze cattle, or from which people can cut down trees for logging, or from which people can extract ore, like uranium, importantly, is almost all on public lands. And they pay fees for doing so, and the fees are almost always fees as it were established in the 19th century. So it amounts to a huge giveaway of the resources of the American people. And the same thing was true in Rome. And when these wealthy interests would get upset, they would insist that somehow the land was theirs, and this so-called agrarian legislation was attempts by essentially the mob to seize the property of the rich, which is emphatically not what was going on. But Cicero largely agrees with these wealthy interests, and speeches of Cicero, and a fair number of literary historians and others making reference into the Roman world, they establish an overwhelming kind of tradition in our literary sources, a representation of these actions as, in essence, mob seizure of the private property of the rich. These are efforts at redistribution of private property. And among other things, the discovery in the 16th century of fragments of this thing that we call the Lex Agraria. It's a generic title. It just means agrarian law, but it's an agrarian law of the year 111. We'd use the Roman name that makes reference to the magistrates if we don't know the magistrate who proposed it, right? The discovery of this law makes it perfectly clear, even if you had never been suspicious of Cicero before, it makes it perfectly clear that the law is doing absolutely nothing of the kind.
Okay.
And it is still true. So in the late medieval period and in the early modern period, and even including a book produced by a political theorist in America in the in the last decade, people continue to write about ancient agrarian laws as if these were efforts at redistribution. And they say, oh, no. Cicero says a primary purpose of the state, qua thing, qua his transhistorical entity. The reason we have states is to protect private property. Well, first of all, nothing of the sort is true in the meaning of the term private in Latin. But quite apart from what the term private means, as in private property, Cicero's representation of the purpose of the state and Cicero's claims about what agrarian laws do are entirely tendentious. Cicero is just lying, and he knows he's lying. I mean, in that particular case.
Yeah.
And we can prove it because we have the text of the law itself.
Yeah.
And that's a case where both a historical tradition and, as it were, a tradition in normative political theory can be corrected by reference to a Roman document.
Yeah. And do you think that you will be correcting other ancient authors by doing that? Because I'm assuming also, I don't know, Livy, Gellius can be corrected in that sense. I imagine them as also not being very trustworthy in that sense.
Yeah. And, I think significant interpretive traditions about why the Roman fostered particular cultures of urbanism in the West. I think in a debate that started taking place around 1990 and going forward, it's about so-called Romanization.
Yeah.
How are we to interpret something like the extraordinary uniformity of the monumentalized urban landscapes of the West?
Yeah.
Who did it? Why did they do it? Blah, 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 blah. The discovery over the last 30 years or so, I think you should be careful. Every number I use should be
Well, we will take it as the mores majorum, something that is
all of the. I mean, actually, some of these fragments go back a long way, and the problem is that we've recently successfully identified them as parts of colonial charts. But let's just say that our modern day knowledge of the actual distribution of Roman municipal charters is just very different than it was 50 years ago, and it's different than it was 100 years ago. Yeah. We now know that this kind of standard form of the Roman municipal charter does not appear simply in Italy and in southern Iberia in the province of Baetica. We now know of copies spread clear along the Danubian provinces in the 2nd century. So both the geographic and chronological range of the use of this document has been utterly transformed. And I'd like to think that serious historians of Roman urbanism and of provincial cultures are going to have to respond to this. And in particular, they will have to respond to it if you make the documents available to them with intelligence and sympathy.
With this last thing that you mentioned, because I know that the project is all about contextualization and translation and all that, but are you using also like spatial knowledge, like where was it displaced? I mean, of course, some laws were discovered, somewhere really far away from where they were. But for example, you mentioned Smyrna and Aphrodisias, this is one of key examples.
I got the assistance of a colleague at the University of Chicago to produce some chronologically layered maps. And we're hoping, frankly, to produce better digital tools. But in speaking about the material as the project was getting going, and in trying to illustrate for audiences something like to make general claims about the historical interest of the material, I have tried to show as it were, a chronological series of maps about where do we find the legislation of the first 50 years of our evidence, for the next 50 years of our evidence, and so forth, to show that in essence, the surviving documents of Roman legislation, they map the ever outward expanding boundaries of the Roman Empire itself. With a few puzzles. In the late 2nd century CE, many conurbations, to use a generic term, many urbanized communities in North Africa begin to refer to themselves in their epigraphy in documents on stone using kind of specialized terms of Latin public law. In essence, they, to use a kind of Roman term, they municipalize. And yet, we have not yet discovered a copy of a Roman municipal or a colonial charter from North Africa. So our sense of the use of this across an ever-expanding geographic area, for the moment, is restricted to the provinces north of the Mediterranean and not to the south. That's a surprise. The absence is a real surprise. And I bet it's a consequence just of the survival of the material. It would be stunning. Now that we know what was going on in the Danubian provinces, it would be stunning if at roughly the same period, these documents were not also being produced in the south.
But don't you think that absence of evidence sometimes talks about different epigraphic practices? Although there's epigraphic culture in the north of Africa, abundant. So
and it's important to remember as regards these documents that when the Romans put documents on stone, quote unquote, reuse of the stone meant often just like turning it over and using it as a stepper's building material, so that you could still find. Or after all, one of the reasons why so many stone inscriptions survive, even if they're worn away or chipped away or broken, is because reuse of a stone potentially preserved the writing. Whereas great big sheets of bronze, where the Romans were kind enough to mine and purify the ore and melt it down and turn it into bronze, sheets of bronze, when you reuse bronze, people melted it down and the writing is gone. In a way, I think it's a complete miracle that we have as much Roman bronze inscriptions as we do. A complete miracle that we have them.
Yeah, maybe, I don't know, they found they were enough important to keep them preserved. I don't know. But I would like, because you have mentioned language several times and the particular terms that they use, even they borrow from other areas. And I know that law and language is something that you have devoted a lot of research to. So let's talk about multilingualism. I mean, I imagine that you have a specialist in Greek epigraphy as well, because we have a multilingual empire with Greek laws. What do you think that this says about, the context of the laws promulgation? Are they translating legal terms in Latin to Greek, and then it makes this kind of like a not very specialized translation? Or what are your thoughts on that?
That's a wonderful, wonderful question. There are questions, and as you were, in essence, an implication that we might as well spell out of your question is, we do know that the Romans produced and permitted, that is to say, the Romans themselves produced Greek translations of Roman documents, and the Romans permitted the translation by others of Roman state documents into Greek. And therefore, because some of these survive, and therefore we can pose questions about the Latin-Greek relationship that it's much harder to pose about other languages. Although it needs to be emphasized, we have very good reason to believe, not in a continuous way, but that there were many other languages were spoken within the Roman Empire, and that we have some epigraphic evidence for 30 of these languages. That is to say, beyond, as it were, claims by the Romans that, there are people living in those mountains over there who speak a language that we find very ugly. And the Romans say things like this all the time about the ugliness of other people's languages. Our evidence is more substantial than our guessing, or our evidence is more substantial than a catalog reference in Pliny. But it's only in Greek, and up to a point much later on in Coptic and Hebrew, that we can say something about the reception in a local language, Hebrew, Coptic, Greek, of something like Roman legal material. Let me take the Greek case because it's in a way historically the most prominent, though I'd be happy to say a little bit about the Hebrew and Coptic situation, with the very important caveat that when I talk about Hebrew and Coptic, I'm talking about other people's scholarship. These are not languages I control. Yes, you're absolutely right that the Greek translation is very significant, and it's illuminating in ways that tend in a number of different interpretive directions. So one thing you could say is that the translations must have been puzzling to Greek. That not simply Latin in its kind of syntax and rhetoric, but legal Latin, the language of statute, was a very kind of distinctive sociolect.
Yeah.
Full of pleonastic uses of pleonastic hyper-references and things like this, full of abbreviations, full of all sorts of oddity, full of technical terms. And translating these documents into Greek produces Greek literature, one uses the term advisedly, produces a form of literature in which the language is kind of brutal and foreign. It's clear that you ain't reading. I mean, Greek public documents voted on by, say, the people of Athens, or produced by the council and then voted on by the people of Athens, are also not like normal Greek literature. So, that a decree or that a law sounds different than a rhetorical speech is well known to Greeks apart from Latin. But the Latin documents are strange. And people in the project who specialize in this sort of thing, but I will just say that alongside these efforts to produce editions of Roman laws, there have been a very interesting and delightful series of attempts by scholars of language to study the passage into Greek of Latin loanwords. There is a kind of scholarly tradition of producing lexica, dictionaries of Greek words used for Roman institutions. There have been specialized versions of these as well as large ones by a guy named Mason, and more recently by a spectacular modern resource produced by a scholar in England named Eleanor Dickey, a really remarkable book.
Yeah.
And there are scholars who work on this in respect of law. But let me say a further thing, because it's not simply a matter of the Latins either brutalizing Greek, and it's not just a matter of the Greeks being confused. I mean, we have a number of very late 2nd century, early 1st century BCE documents, sometimes literary documents and sometimes epigraphic documents, in which the Greeks react to the Romans. And they're basically like, who are these people? I mean, probably the most famous is the reference to the form of the Roman state that appears in the book of Maccabees, where these crazy Jews are sitting there. The crazy Jews are sitting there saying, you know what? Do you know how we're going to resist those ridiculous Seleucids? We're going to make friends with the Romans. Who are the Romans, I hear you say? Well, the Romans are these crazy people who live 1,000 kilometers away across the sea. And they don't have, and they have a Senate in which all these old guys sit at this, and they give power to one person each year, and they make him a king. Or, I don't remember all the details, but it's a hilarious description in Maccabees of who the Romans are and how powerful they are and the form of their government. And it's more or less a combination of accurate and wild fancy. So in the initial, not just years, but in the initial decades of Roman encounter with Greek encounters with Roman institutions, there's a lot of confusion about language, institutions, and so forth. But there are also features of these Greek documents which make it clear, I think, that the Romans, or the translators at least, are trying to make the documents sound in important respects like Greek.
Okay.
So some of the terms that appear in this provincial legislation of the year 101, some of the Greek vocabulary exists in a tradition of Greek normative writing about public resources going back into the 4th century, long before. So some of the vocabulary looks Greek. If you say to yourself, why did they use this word? The answer is it's how the Greeks talked about the resources of the state. And you ask yourself, what Latin word is it translating? Could be vectigalia. It could be some word for taxation. It's actually hard to tell, because every now and then an effort is made to make the legislation idiomatically Greek in a way that's surprising, to such an extent that it vaguely obscures our guess as to what the Latin original might have looked like.
So instead of including like a Latin term into a Greek text, they will describe it in Greek, because I imagine that they are evidently Roman institutions that they don't exist in the Greek world. So I didn't know if they Greekicize some Latin word, like I don't know, like a vectigale or something like that instead of vectigalia.
And if you look at these, in any given context, words like this can present a puzzle. One of the most famous cases is the term res publica, public thing, right? It's hard to imagine a more important kind of central core concept to Roman political theory than res publica. And yet, if you actually think about the things that are denominated res publica, from something like the state itself to public properties, like actual things that the people own and so forth, many different things are called res publica. And if you look even at a single document, say the Greek translation of the Res Gestae of the autobiography of the Emperor Augustus, 4 different Greek words are used over the course of the Res Gestae to translate Res Publica. Because, they were sensitive, or at least particular translators could be quite sensitive to the problem that there was no one-to-one mapping between these lexemes in Latin and Greek. And likewise, even with very simple terms like consul, lictor, fasces, and things like this. If you go to one of these lexica of Greek words for Roman institutions, it will turn out that at different moments and different periods in time, or different translations were used. And as a linguist, you could look at this and say there are quote unquote translations or contexts of loaning of Latin into Greek in which they just do a transliteration. And there are contexts in which they try to find a Greek lexeme that describes a functional equivalent, although it might at some level be misleading because many different, you could say theories, but also many different kinds of translation are going on when they move Latin into Greek.
I have just one final question, and I will be off your back because I'm really stealing out of your time. So I know you've been working on that, and now we have talked about what it's visible from a translation, but I know you've been working a lot on fictions. And I know that this is a field that I find that there's still a lot to do. So concerned with the fact that, before 212, and we are not going to get into Constantinople, not everyone is a Roman citizen, and that laws will not, maybe apply for many people in the Roman Empire. Have you traced any kind of language structure that refers to fiction, or that we can infer a fiction that in a way that an important law will also be helpful for people who are not Roman citizens?
Yes. So here, the work that I've performed on these statutes has changed how I think about the history of Roman fictions in interesting ways. So as you will know, and the listeners probably know, legal fictions are a particular kind of conceptual and verbal sleights of hand in which most famously it is asserted that something that is not an object C, that is not in category A, which is to say a human being who is not a Roman citizen, will be treated as if he's inside the category of Roman citizen for the purposes of adjudicating a particular dispute. Or, you have some poor individual owns an iPhone to which they can't prove title, but they've been using it. And you have rules in Roman law for, what the English term being usucapion, which comes, of course, from the Latin, in essence, to seize or control something through use, right? You have Roman rules that if you have to have had continuous use of a thing for X years. It depends on the class of object. Before you own it as opposed to merely control it or possess it. And if you lose it before that time period is up, then you have not lost something you own. You've merely lost something that you possessed. And that has different consequences. And so the Romans would occasionally employ a legal fiction in which they said, even though Amelia she can't prove that it was her iPhone, we will treat her as having completed the term limit of usucapion. So we will treat her as if she's the owner for the purposes of settling this dispute. And those are legal fictions. And legal fictions have excited a lot of kind of historical and philosophical interest. And one of the reasons they've incited philosophical interest is a whole lot of what you might call conservative voices have said, fictions are bad. And the reason fictions are bad is we have laws, and the laws are voted on by the people. And the people, as a kind of abstraction, if the people wanted to give Amelia ownership of her phone, they would have changed the law. Or if the people wanted to treat Cliff as if he was a citizen of Spain, right, they would have said the law applies to citizens and non-citizens. But they didn't say that. And judges should not be using sleights of hand at the level of procedure to embrace all these classes of things which are not actually literally mentioned in the law. So one of the features of historical criticism of fictions is that they're judge-made law and not voted on by the people. And what I have found, or at least what I think is totally fascinating about the statutes, is that the very, very, very first Roman law that we have contains a fiction. And the very second Roman law we have contains a fiction. And two things about this are interesting. One, to spell out the implications that I was just saying, fictions don't arise at the level of procedure or interpretation. They are part of the language of statute itself. They are part of the very, very, very original language of statute.
So
right?
They are part of the essence of lawmaking.
The absolute essence of lawmaking, not of legal interpretation, one. And two, all the early legal fictions are about the extension of legal actions to non-citizen persons and things. That is to say, there is a sense in which it looks like our data set is imperfect. It looks like it was felt. Latin legal language can accurately describe Roman reality. But when they have the problem, how do we deal with non-Roman territory in Italy? And especially, how do we deal with non-Roman territory in Africa? We're not sure. We are not confident that our Latin language accurately describes those spaces and things. And therefore, we will use fiction to assimilate them or to describe them as if they were Roman in order to make the law capable of regulating them. And the same thing happens in the Roman law. In the very first Roman law, we have regulating social life north of the Apennine, right? And you have to remember, in the Roman Republic, Italy ended at the Apennines. So the Po Valley, Milan, Bologna and so on, were regarded as part of Gaul, not as part of Italy. And therefore, the extension of Roman law was literally to the extension of non-Italian Spain. And there are a whole series of legal fiction in the very first law for Cisalpine Gaul. And so I think it's clear that, one, legal fictions are part of Roman law in lawmaking from the absolute beginning of Roman law, or from the earliest evidence we have. And two, it was particularly felt useful to regulate non-Roman stuff. So legal fictions are part of Roman law because Roman law is a law of an empire, would be one potential conclusion.
I think it's a wonderful conclusion, but because it makes it more inclusive. I mean, despite the fact that we have said before, Romans mock everything, that sounds strange, but they accept them in their law. So it's a nice conclusion. I'm really looking forward to see the results. So just to end up with this episode, where can we plug some results? When do you expect to have something in your webpage?
We have the tools to start publishing. And my hope is that before the end of 2025, we'll have a version of the introduction and some preliminary laws posted, because one of the things I would like to do is for, as it were, the final version of the project to reflect some input from users. So the question being, indices, lexical tools, commentaries, the hyperlinking to other textual and research resources. It would be great for the project. There's no reason to think that the 15 or 16 experts who are participating now, that the 15 of us comprehend all possible uses of the resource.
You hold all the knowledge, yeah.
So one beauty of publishing a digital resource as opposed to a book is that you can, as it were, get input from users before final publication. It's a living research tool.
Yeah.
And
it would be great if you could have something digital, like a marginalia, we can be the writers of marginalia on the side of these laws and all that.
Indeed, they can show up just like in an old copy of the digest. You could try and get it to display on the screen so that the marginalia is surrounded at greater and greater remove from the core document.
Yeah. And in fact, it would be great if you can make something look so pretty as well, that I like how it looks like super organized, because when I look at my marginalia, for example, from this conversation, it really doesn't look like these nice copies. Yeah. So, thank you very much again, Cliff, for your time and for all this enriching discussion. I wish you the best for this last sprint. Thank you very much again for being here with us.
Thank you very much, and have a lovely day.
Thank you, you too.